So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sonia Jones, and I'm the Curator of Collections at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery here in Oshawa. The Mississauga of the Anishinaabe Nation and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat are the traditional caretakers of these territories, and Indigenous people from across Turtle Island now call this region home. Today, you'll be hearing about Oshawa in the 1920s as told by historical photographs from the Oshawa Public Libraries, Oshawa Museum, and the Robert McLaughlin Gallery's collections. As we reflect on Oshawa in the 1920s, it's really important to acknowledge that we are speaking about a time in this community's history that coincides with the signing of the Williams Treaties in 1923. This is the colonial agreement made between the Government of Canada and the Mississaugas of Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Scugog Island, the Chippewas of Beausoleil, Georgina Island, and the Rama. While treaties are supposed to enshrine certain rights to land and resources, these First Nations of the Williams Treaties continue to fight for their rights and sustainable use of this land by all who live here. For me, territorial acknowledgement is an important reminder that we're all treaty partners and that these acknowledgements are a call to continue to recognize our co-commitments to each other and to share our thanks to be living and working in this area. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Nicole Adams. Nicole is the local history and genealogy librarian at the Oshawa Public Libraries. Nicole oversees the local history room collection housed at the McLaughlin branch in downtown Oshawa. She's worked in public galleries for over 20 years and brings a love of history and solving puzzles to her work in helping others find links to their family and community history. Today, she's going to share her knowledge and research about what Oshawa was like in the 1920s. And this talk complements the RMG's online exhibition, The Roaring Twenties in Oshawa, which I've shared in the chat, the link to browse the online exhibition. And now I pass it to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Sonia. As Sonia mentioned, this is to complement an exhibit, an online exhibition put on by the RMG, and I put the link actually on the opening slide here, so you can take a look at that. And it's a partnership between the Pickering Museum, Canadian Automotive Museum, Parkwood Estates, and Central Counties Tourism. So I will then proceed with my talk on the Oshawa in the Roaring Twenties. Now, this is a talk that I've given in the past for our local history spotlight earlier, actually last fall, and there's sort of a slightly different version of that you'll find on YouTube on the Oshawa Library's website. So Oshawa in the 20s was a pivotal year in the development of this city. Now, this is by no means a comprehensive history, and there will be aspects of Oshawa's history that I'm not able to touch on today because it's just a brief lunch hour session that we're doing today. But I hope you will enjoy the glimpse into the 100 years ago of Oshawa's history. I've pulled together images from the gallery, from Robert McLaughlin Gallery, the Oshawa Library, and the Oshawa Museum to tell this story. So what did Oshawa look like in the 1920s? Now, the decade was known as the Roaring Twenties in North America and Western Europe, and the period was saw the large-scale development and use of automobiles, telephones, films, radio, electrical appliances, and changing the lives of millions in the Western world. And after World War I, 15% unemployment left many Canadians out of work in the early 20s. And by the mid-20s, though, things were looking up. So you can see here, we've got a nice image this is from the Oshawa Museum. And it's sort of looking forward, I think, into the decade. This is from the 1920, and they're looking through a telescope hopefully into the future of the 1920s. They probably couldn't have imagined that 2020 and 2021 would be just as roaring and sometimes problematic as they have been in the last couple of years. So we wonder sometimes when I'm reading literature about the 1920s, and often writers of articles today are saying, are we going to have another roaring 20s in the 2020s following the pandemic? And hopefully we're coming out of that. And what kind of changes are happening in our lives as they had happened in the past for Oshawa residents. Now, Oshawa is often referred to at this time as the Manchester of Canada because of the abundance of industrial concerns and as factories, foundries, mills, and tanneries. Oshawa was well placed to be part of the economic boom due in large part to the keen business sense of one Colonel R.S. McLaughlin, who made the decision in 1907 to transition his father's carriage company business into making automobiles. He accomplished this by partnering with American William Durant, head of Buick, to form the McLaughlin Buick Company. And in 1918, this officially became the General Motors of Canada. And this proved to be a very wise decision on the part of R.S. McLaughlin. The growing popularity of the automotive industry resulted in an influx of Oshawa's population, growing from 4,000 in 1915 to over 15,500 in 1924. This allowed Oshawa to seek incorporation, and on the 8th of March 1924, Oshawa became a city, and there were day-long celebrations. Here you see the paper of the time. March 8th, 1924, the Ontario Reformer. Oshawa became Ontario's 25th city at noon today. Here's a quote from the paper. Oshawa's march of progress took a decisive step forward at 12 o'clock today when the blowing of whistles, the ringing of bells, and the firing of a 25-gun salute saw the dawn of a new era for Ontario's greatest industrial centre. And it threw off the frayed cloak of townhood and emerged with the full regalia of a city. This is the Oshawa's Town Hall in 1924 at the time. This building sat at the corner of Simcoe Street North and Richmond Street. It is no longer there. This is some glimpses of busy Oshawa at the time. This is from the Daily Telegram the same day in 1924, showing all the different business concerns that were very bustling during this time period, and as well as showing little shots of the city. And this was taken from the paper, so the pictures aren't great quality, but I'll be touching on some of these a little bit later. Just to get an idea, this is how they were promoting themselves to the wider community and encouraging industry and business to settle in this area. And there was a whole section of the paper devoted to, please come to Oshawa. We have so many opportunities for growing businesses. Continuing the quote from the paper, from a manufacturing standpoint, such firms as General Motors, Ontario Malleable Iron, Peddler's Fittings, Robson Leather, W.E. Phillips became household names throughout Canada. It is largely due to their energy, foresight, and good business ability that Oshawa today is being proclaimed a city. The automobile industry grew and public demand for cars increased, and by 1929, there were over 1 million cars in Canada, and the automotive industry introduced assembly line work, and because of this, they were able to hire cheaper and less skilled laborers. Now, while the Oshawa GM plant at this time was employing 8,100 individuals by 1929. But of course, with prosperity, sometimes comes a bit of a darker side. Employees were dissatisfied with their jobs. While jobs were plentiful at General Motors and other factories, the growth and prosperity of the companies didn't trickle down to the workers in terms of fair pay. And in the case of General Motors, or in this case, McLaughlin Motor Car Company, during the war, workers at the McLaughlin Motor Car Company had reluctantly agreed to lower wages as part of their patriotic duty. But after the war, inflation made it difficult for many people because of wages no longer covered the cost of living, rent, and food. So workers demanded more money, and confrontation with employers was inevitable. On March 28th, 1928, workers walked out on the job and went on strike, which made international headlines, as did the closure of local liquor stores at the time, which stated that they did not want strikers to waste their money. The strike committee declared the body of workers would be made members of the International Automobile Industrial Workers Union. The strike lasted 4 days, and sorry, my slide was a little bit behind there. They were seeking better wages and better working hours. They were looking for a 40-hour work week. So in March of 1928, they striked. It lasted 4 days. The Oshawa Daily Times on March 30th, 1928, declared the strike to be over, and all GM employees would be reporting back to work on the Monday. And they were going to conciliation, it appeared, and old rates of pay were in effect for the meantime until they were able to work something out. But this wasn't the last time that there were labor issues. And it was not the last strike to be seen in Oshawa, as there was a much larger one that would come along in 1937. Now, with all this, the new cars on the road, new safety concerns became apparent. And you can see from this image here, which is showing the four corners of Oshawa with the town hall in the background, people crossing the street. You can see the streetcar tracks on the road, that there is a officer who is directing traffic with the manually operated traffic sign. And it was not until 1924 that the first electric traffic lights were installed in Ontario. And at this time, Oshawa was one of the first to get those, because we were the automotive center. We needed traffic control in the four corners. Now, how did people get around the city? Of course, we talk about cars. There were still horse and carts at this time. And the streetcars were a big thing, mainly the Oshawa Railway Company, which offered both freight and passenger service. Showing a passenger car here on Simcoe Street, just across from the Oshawa Library in the background on the right, and the Simcoe Street United Church on the left. So started in the 1870s, the Oshawa Railway proved very useful to the citizens and industries of Oshawa during the 1920s. The focus on the Oshawa Railway was on Simcoe Street through the middle of Oshawa, and not only did this serve most residents during their connections with the town's downtown and the port of Oshawa, 9 lines of main line were built north from the lake, along with 2 miles of double track, and 1 mile of passing siding. Now, the railway was built with to be electric from the start. At the time of its inception, there were 9 miles of main line, 2 lines of second track, and it ran from the lake north to Roslyn Road. Fares for passengers were 6 cents or 5 tickets for 25 cents. The Oshawa Railway was to be used for both passenger and freight service, which you can see on the map here. The passenger service is the dotted line, and the freight service is the solid line. And they were available right down to the pier at the harbor. By 1929, after improvements, there were 18 miles of track and 6 freight cars and 8 passenger cars. Now, in the summer of 1881, the first telephone central office was installed in Oshawa. But of course, not everyone had phones. Into the 1920s and 30s, when people started getting phones in their businesses and in residences. At the time it started, there were only 4 employees and 25 subscribers in 1881. But by the 1920s, the telephone had become a standard household appliance, with over 2,500 telephones in the city, served by 25 operators. Telephone lines were shared by many neighbors, called party lines, which meant anyone could listen in on your conversation. So if anyone's lived in a rural area, as I did when I was growing up, party lines mean that you have a different ring. So you pick up only when your ring, when you hear your ring, not your neighbor's ring. Also kind of challenging if you need to make a call and your neighbor's already on the line. So that's what the beginning of the phone service was. Newspapers in Oshawa. By the 1920s, the Ontario Reformer had been serving Oshawa for over 50 years, and it was served by other papers as well. The Ontario Reformer, in this case, you see the paper boys for the Ontario Reformer in 1925, and they were employing over 60 people and 26 delivery boys. Starting out as a weekly paper, by 1920, it had moved to 3 times weekly, printing over 3,500 copies with each printing. Other newspapers serving the area at the time were the Oshawa Telegram, the Ontario Reformer, And the Ontario Reformer actually came out with a junior edition for a brief period in 1926, which was 6 months worth of, it was a monthly paper that came out, greetings to our young readers, talking about interesting things for young people. So games, talking about books at the library they could borrow, as well as sporting events and different interactions that kids would be interested in. It was only a single sheet of paper that came out briefly in the 1926. So they were trying to cater to the younger readers as well. And later on, this paper became, the Ontario Reformer became the Oshawa Daily Reformer, and then later the Oshawa Daily Times. Sorry, my slides went backwards there for a second. So like most communities, Oshawa had a great boom in economic activity in the 1920s, owing to the advent of the automobile and related industries. And the abundance of jobs meant that people had money to spend and, of course, places to put it, hence the banks that were needed, and other businesses were expanding to meet the demand. So in Oshawa, there were 5 main banks at this time, actually 6 main banks were with branches in Oshawa. Some of these, such as the Dominion and Standard Bank, date back over half a century from this time, and banks with branches in Oshawa were the Dominion, Standard, Montreal, Commerce, Royal, and Union banks. And these names will be familiar to some of you because, of course, Bank of Commerce, Dominion Bank, and Royal Bank are still entities today. Now, what did it cost a family to live in Oshawa at the time? This is a family budget from 1928. And it's, you can see from this weekly budget that what it cost for a family of 5 to live in that year, broken down by how many cents each of these items would cost, and then giving a total of $23.17 for the week. So this tells you an estimate of how much it would cost an average family just to supply with basic foods and laundry, gas and electricity, and coal for heating. So a snapshot of where those services could be acquired from. This is from the 1928 Oshawa Vernon's directories. There was over 12 groceries, 6 bakeries, dairies, drugstores, garages, dentists, all sorts of services that were available. There was even a library which had opened in 1909, the Oshawa Library on Simcoe Street, which we saw in the earlier shot of the streetcar. So these are an idea of the businesses that existed at the time. And you might want to consult our Oshawa City Directories if you're curious about the past of Oshawa. Check out the Oshawa City Directories page on the Oshawa Library website. We have all of the directories from 1921 to 2001 digitized and available online. So it's a really great way to look at a snapshot of a city if you're wondering what used to be at a certain place, or even to see where your family, if they're from Oshawa, where they lived in the past. So you see an ad on the side for Todd's Bread. The bakery was at 48 Bond Street West, and in 1927, they had 10 wagons delivering each day. This is a shot of a float for Todd's Bread in 1925 during a parade. Also, we have the Oshawa Dairy, Oshawa institution. First run by George Hart and Sons since 1910, they moved operations to a brand new building at 431 Simcoe Street South in 1927. The image here shows that milk was still delivered by horse and cart at this time, but they were also beginning to use trucks for delivery. So it would also be nice to get food delivery. It seems to be a thing now during the pandemic where we get all our food delivered. That's not necessarily a new thing. It happened back then too. So the 20s was a revisiting of staying at home and having food delivered to you. It happened very much back then as well. With the advent of cars, though, people were getting out a lot more. And as people lived close to the city center, they would walk into downtown Oshawa where all of these businesses were. And there was often specialty shops that they would go to. If they needed bread, they'd go to one place. If they needed dairy, they'd go to another. If they needed meat, they'd go to yet another. One of the general groceries was Puckett Brothers and Silly. Sorry, Puckett Brothers and Silly, or Siley. I don't know how to pronounce that. I think I pronounced that incorrectly. And you can see in the windows, this is from 1920, you can see in the windows, of course, the proud owners of this establishment. You can see the entrance: canned goods, merchandise for sale, 2 posters, 1 in each shop window, showing advertising for imported goods and cheese and butter. And another institution which you'll recognize, we have the Loblaws Groceteria, which is an interesting terminology. Groceteria, I think it's a name that didn't survive. But in 1924, they had 2 locations, a location in Oshawa, 35 Simcoe Street North. And the building is still there, I believe, but it, of course, is not a Loblaws anymore. But it looks very much like a general grocery, like the image just before, where you see all the wares kind of displayed in the window. And we sell for less. So Loblaws has survived into the modern era, looking much different. But if you're looking for a butcher shop in 1922, you went into a shop looking much like this, where they had all of their wares on display. And it wasn't just neatly packaged up like you would see in your local butcher shop today. The actual bird you were buying was right there on the counter. And of course, sawdust on the floor. You can see here the store is decorated for Christmas. The plenitude of meats and fowl displayed on the counter suggests that Oshawa was a prosperous town at the time. Note the turkeys on the counter. Though they are plucked, they still retain feathered wings. Turkey wings were prized as feather dusters at this time. It also seems that sawdust covered the floor, judging by the uneven edges at the counter front. You can see at the bottom here. Now, Jury and Lovell, Lovell Drugs is still an entity today. In 1911, Mr. Lovell took over the drugstore business from Mr. Gregory in Oshawa, and the store became Jury and Lovell. And you can see a clipping here at the top, taken from 1924 newspaper, Jury and Lovell at the time. They were 30 years in business at this stage. And this is where you would go to get all of your medicine and topical ointments, and oftentimes later on, they would have a soda fountain in them as well. You can see the ceiling here, which is one of the metal press ceilings from peddler people in Oshawa. And a lot of the businesses downtown had these ceilings at the time. You can see actually in the previous shot, not that one. Oh, I think I've gone the wrong way in my slides. I apologize. The next slide shows Bassett's Retail. Jewelers. So Bassett's actually was on the corner of Simcoe Street and King Street on the southeast corner. And this building is still there. It opened in 1926. And you can see someone sort of sampling the wares in the window here. This is actually where the buses stop, right here in front of this building. It was once a sandwich shop. It was a Laura Secord for a time. And up above, they're actually renovating this building now. So I'm really curious to see what it will look like when they're done. I doubt it'll look much like this. Maybe it'll bring it back to the 1920s aesthetic, but I have a feeling that they might not. Ward and Dooland. I just love this shot, a nighttime shot of the Ward's draperies at the time. Now, they opened in the 1920s. Ward and Dooland opened in 1920 by J.C. Ward and W.A. Dooland. The store was also known as Ward's Dry Goods and Ward's Department Store. Now, it remained at this location. It was on Simcoe Street and Athol on the northeast corner, and is now occupied by the Fazio's restaurant. And then later on, Ward's moved around the corner. You can see the pressed ceiling I was referring to, little very intricate designs on the ceiling, just give it a nice just a really nice look for the stores. They would all have these in them. Now, this is just the interior of the Wards at the time in 1920. And it remained at this location until 1976, as I mentioned. Then it moved to King Street. And it was there until 2010 as Ward's Draperies. So they were a family-owned business for all that time. Now, there was a building boom, of course, with all the people, all the businesses moving into the area, people moving into the area to work for those businesses. There was lots of opportunity for building, lots of housing going up. And of course, lots of businesses were putting up, setting up shop. Now you see here, this is a building, the Bank of Commerce, I mentioned, there were banks in the city. This was a new building they were putting up in 1920. The new building went up just south of Bonds Street on Simcoe, the west side. This building is still there today. As multiple businesses have been there. The storefront at the lower half have changed a little bit with glassed fronting, but the top looks very much the same. Now, Peddler People is an entity in Oshawa that existed for quite a long time, and it used to be at the site of Memorial Park. And in 1920, they closed up shop there and opened up this brand new factory on Simcoe Street South. So this employed a lot of people. Manufacturers of a wide variety of metal products in Oshawa, as I mentioned, those ceilings. Since 1861, during the post-war period, the family-run business prospered in 1920, moved to a new location. They were proudly marketed as the largest sheet metal factory in the Commonwealth, employing between 400 and 500 people. The land was bought the land that it occupied before, the site of the Peddler plant in 1920 was bought by the city and was made into a park and was being developed after the factory was torn down. You can see here, this is a photo from the RMG collection. The ground is all torn up from where the factory used to sit. And behind us in the picture, in the background of the picture, you see on the left, that's St. George's Anglican Church, which moved shortly after this. A few years later, they tore this down and they built one just further up the street at the corner of Athol and Center. And the other building on the right is the Center Street School, which in 1923 was torn down to build the Center Street School, which became EA Level School. Now on the site of the park, Memorial Park was erected. Garden of the Unforgotten, the cenotaph bearing the names of fallen soldiers, was dedicated in 1924. And the war memorial that stands today is due to the efforts of Dr. T.E. Kaiser, who along with the Memorial Committee undertook a massive fundraising drive to honor those who were lost during World War I. And the memorial and the surrounding gardens are called the Garden of the Unforgotten. Now talking about the building boom, here's the new St. George's, or this was actually an artist's drawing of St. George's as it went up in 1922 at the corner of Athol and Center Street. And the bell tower as well. You can hear the bells, working downtown here, you can hear the bells mostly every day from this church. Given the growing community in the 1910s, the public schools had become inadequate for the growing community, and 3 new schools were built in the early part of 1920s. The Center Street School, which I mentioned, was torn down and rebuilt as the Center Street School, and Ritson Road School, as well as Simcoe Street North School, which is now Dr. S.J. Phillips School. And a lot of these schools have similar designs as well if you look at them. The Ritson Street School is not in operation anymore. And the Center Street School, which is EA level, is an adult education center for Durham region. Now, the hospital was built in 1910, but by the 1920s, expansion was required given the size of the city now. So the photo shows 3 structural changes that have been made in the original building since it opened in 1910. The Peddler Surgical Wing to the east, 1914, and the McLaughlin Maternity Wing to the west, and the removal of the roof and subsequent replacement with another story above the original structure, this is the original structure here, and it's been built on multiple times. It started as, it looked almost like a house, and it was built on over a period of time. And of course, Lake Ridge Health Oshawa sits on this site today. Much, much larger and pretty much unrecognizable. This is a recognizable building, the Alger office building, which was built at between 35 and 37 King Street East, across from the Regent Theatre. It was built in 1928 to replace the first Alger Press building, which was destroyed by fire in 1927. And you see here, this is them fighting that fire. The building now houses restaurants on the ground floor and apartments above. And this is a very 1920s view. This is taken from the back of an advertisement for this particular office building. Here we have the Masonic Temple, which was built in 1929. And this building has very little changed over the past 90 years. This is right near Memorial Park at the corner of Metcalfe and Center Street. It is just across from the library. And this was the architect's drawing, showed the beauty of the design of the Masonic Temple. And of course, the Genealogy Hotel. Just at the end of the decade, we have the somewhat iconic Genealogy Hotel, which has been a fixture of downtown Oshawa for many, many years, close to 100 years now, and has recently undergone a wonderful rejuvenation. It is now apartment buildings. It's now apartments, and it has sat vacant and had an uncertain future for quite a few years, quite a few decades, actually. In the background, you can see the Regent Theatre on the left, as well as the clock tower of the post office. Now, for entertainment, what did people do for arts and leisure? Entertainment. Radio programs, where widespread use of the radio began to break down the isolation between far-flung communities. It soon became a necessity, bringing news as well as popular culture and entertainment into Canadian homes across the country. The radio was a revolutionary development. Smaller Canadian stations, however, found it difficult to compete with bigger, more powerful stations from the United States. You can see here that a lot of the ones listed, for example, from Tulsa, Washington, Richmond, Detroit, these are all advertised in the Oshawa paper of easy-to-find programs on your radio. So it was hard for smaller Canadian stations to compete. Nearly 300,000 Canadians were tuning into American stations for their news and entertainment. And this is an advertisement from the 1924 asking if people are in the air yet, meaning, do you have a radio yet? Are you enjoying the most fascinating of modern inventions? And these were quite expensive. You think about how much it costs the family and their family budget to live for a week. It's $23.17. A radio running from $50 to $150 is a really large expenditure for a family of the time. And we have the Regent Theatre, a couple of theaters in the city, a couple of which I'm going to be touching on. Now, this was not... this was built in 1919, but just at the beginning of the decade, it kind of came into its own. So radio entertainment was rivaled by moving pictures in the movies. At first, movies were silent, and orchestra played and a piano would provide sound effects to accompany the silent screen, and while studios conveyed the message and dialogue. The talkies arrived in 1927 with comedians such as Laurel and Hardy and the Marx Brothers producing films, among many others. So at this time, they would have been showing silent films when the Regent Theatre first started, and some theatrical productions. It was originally erected in 1919 and staged both theater acts and films. The theater was home to innovative features for its time, including an air conditioning system that consisted of fans blowing over blocks of ice to cool the large auditorium. This was replaced in the 1920s by a system that pumped cold water through the building, which proved much more effective. Another theater of the time was the New Martin Theater. It mainly started with vaudeville photoplays and road shows. So traveling road shows would be advertised in the paper for this theater. Ernie Marks, who was later a mayor of Oshawa, he bought the New Martin Theater in 1927 and sort of increased its reach and had a lot more interesting programming. Now, Lakeview Park opened in 1920. Actually, Colonel R.S. McLaughlin again and his brother George McLaughlin bought the land in the name of General Motors of Canada, and then they deeded this to the town of Oshawa on condition that it would be held for use as a public park to benefit the citizens of Oshawa. And one of the most interesting aspects, of course, people used to take picnics here a lot. Some of the pictures you'll see from our collections will be people picnicking or vacationing at the Oshawa Lakeview Park. Before the park was established, there were cottages down there. People would go to the lake for their summer vacations, and the streetcar would be a short ride away. So much like we would go to the cottage today, people of Oshawa would travel to the lake at Oshawa. Now, of course, in the early 1920s, Oshawa was not the lake was not part of Oshawa. It only became part of Oshawa when it was annexed and included in 1924 when we became a city. The border of Oshawa went from Bloor Street, which was called Baseline, and went further south to include the lake. Now within the park, we have the buffaloes, which was a unique thing. One of the most interesting features of Lakeview Park is the several buffaloes, which called the park home. These were brought in the early 20s. The idea of George McLaughlin to start a zoo in Lakeview Park, and these were brought from Alberta. There were 4 of them. And they survived there until the 1930s when they were taken to a zoo in Toronto. So they were there for close to a decade, I believe, kind of an anomaly, but there's reports in the papers of them being smelly and nobody wanted them there. It was kind of an odd thing. Now, also in the park were the pavilions, namely the Jubilee Pavilion, which opened in 1927. So this is an opening advertisement for the new Jubilee Pavilion. One constant in Lakeview Park has always been the pavilions. Today, there's the Jubilee Pavilion still stands. And there was also Barnhart's Pavilion, which was located nearer to the beach. Which was established in 1920, the same year as Lakeview Park's opening. Now, Barnhart's Pavilion had been called something else before that, but Barnhart's took it over in 1920. In the early days, the Jubilee Pavilion was operated in the summer only, with dancing 6 nights a week. And in the 1940s, the city winterized this building so it could be used year-round. And of course, this was called the Jubilee Pavilion to honor Canada's Diamond Jubilee anniversary of Confederation, which was 1867. Oshawa was known for its parks. We had Alexander Park, which we still have today, but it was a lot more active back then. There were a lot more activities happening. This is a site of major outdoor events, racing, annual fairs, and leisure activities. And this image is taken from the Oshawa Fair in the 1920s. And also we have advertisements for the annual fair of the 1923 in Alexander Park in the fall. There were trials of speed, livestock, baby shows, and a midway and musical entertainment as well over a period of 3 days. Midweek as well, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, actually, in the middle of the week. Another advertisement for the same time period is Fair Week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So this is a different year. This is not the Ontario Agricultural Fair. This is the Oshawa Fair, also celebrated in the fall. And this is, you can see in the background, the tower, which appeared in the Alexander Park. Also, the Oshawa Golf and Curling Club, which was established in 1906, had its course extended in the early 1920s to a full 18 holes with 23 bunkers. This image is taken from the Oshawa Golf and Curling Club website, so I wanted to give them credit for that. This is sort of outdoor amusements that were popular at the time. Some views of the city from 1920s. This is King Street West at Church Street. The King Street Chambers are in the background here. This building is still there. It's built in the 1830s. It's called Oshawa House now. It was called Oshawa House then. It was a a hotel first, and then apartments, and it is now apartments above and businesses below. It's a cafe below. The buildings to the right of the image are no longer there. It's occupied by an office tower. King Street looking east. The Regent Theatre you can see just in the left-hand corner, and GM in the top left. At the time, this is General Motors of Canada, and you can see that the houses along here on King Street are no longer there. The corner here is Mary Street, which is called Prospect Street. This is where the Jonash Hotel is now, and all these other houses on this corner are not there either. You can see a church in the distance here. This would be the King Street United Church here, which burned down in the 1960s. And the north side of King Street East, this is looking the other way, the Regent Theatre, the post office to tell the time. If you didn't have a wristwatch on, you could always tell what time it was, and other businesses along King Street looking towards the west, and the cars you can see as well. These help us date photographs as well, looking at the types of cars and vehicles that appear in the pictures. The Regent Theatre doesn't have a large marquee on the front. There are photographs in the 1930s which have a large marquee jutting out the front telling which films are playing, but this was not there at that time. As I said, this is a brief overview of Oshawa in the 1920s. I thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. We actually have one question in the Q&A, and please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A anytime now, and I'll be sure that Nicole gets them. So when Cynthia asks, when was the Regent actually built?
In 1919.
Okay, great. So some things that really stood out to me that I wouldn't mind discussing is that we always hear about the 1937 strike as being like, that's the GM strike that people talk about the most. And this 1928 strike is not as talked about. And it's really interesting. I just wanted to know if you knew a little bit more about, like, did the workers feel satisfied with the results of the strike? Did they get what they were seeking?
They did not. From the paper at the time, the sad part about researching a lot of things in Oshawa's history, of course, as you know, Sonia, is the papers are missing for a lot of period before 1945. We don't have a lot of the papers that have survived due to a fire at the Oshawa Times, which was the Oshawa Reformer. So we don't have a whole lot of papers from the time. And I was looking at Toronto papers. Of course, it was internationally covered, as was the 1937. 1937 was way more successful. I think the workers came out of the 1928 feeling that they acquired a little bit of move forward, such as a better work week. So they had more leisure time. They weren't at work for 60 hours a week. And I think they got a slight increase in pay, but they didn't have as many rights and increases as they would have liked to see, given the popularity and the prosperity of the businesses they were working for. So I think it sort of set them on a course for 9 years later striking again, and that one was a 3-week strike, which brought the country to a halt, and people had to stand up and take notice. So that's the strike that most people refer to when they think of the Oshawa strike, and I think Lisa Terich at the Oshawa Museum has done a presentation on this on the Oshawa strike recently, and you can find that on their website, the Oshawa Museum. But they would know a whole lot more about that than I would. But in researching this initially, and again this week, I was reading a little bit about it, and they weren't as satisfied. So it's sort of but it got them a taste for standing up for themselves, I think, which early on, coming out of World War, like I mentioned, World War I, they voluntarily took pay cuts, and then that wasn't automatically increased when the war was over, even though the companies themselves were quite prosperous. So yeah, there was a lot of disgruntled.
A 4-day strike is really quick. And also it's just interesting to me that they didn't get quite what they wanted, but it came to a kind of resolution pretty quickly. So we have another question from Cynthia. So when did horse and buggies become a rare sight on Oshawa streets?
It was in this decade, actually. it's hard to pinpoint exactly. I would say earlier in the decade rather than later. We saw a picture of the Oshawa dairy still had a horse and cart where they were delivering. And that picture is actually from very late in the 20s. But I think they built a new building in 1927. And in that picture, there are buggies as well as, like, there's horses as well as trucks. So it's a transition around the mid 20s, I think 25, 26, you start to see the horses not being used as much. It had to do a lot with if a business was able to switch how they were providing their service, if it was cheaper for them initially. But I think it also became the city, and looking into the bylaws, I think having clean city streets was very important. And it's hard to do that when you have horses. Cars are a little bit cleaner and what they leave on the road. Not cleaner for the air, of course. I think we'd be better off with horses. The environment would be better off if we still rode horses. So that's usually how I can date photographs. And you'll be aware of this too, Sonia, when you're looking at, it's like, oh, there's a horse. Someone's riding a horse and cart. Okay, that's got to be before the 1920s or before. You don't see them in the 30s and 40s. So I'd say by 1925, they were almost not seen by anything but maybe delivery wagons.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Eh?
Now that's in the city. In rural areas, people still used horses and buggies way longer. Yeah. But you're thinking about Oshawa as a city. Oshawa as a city was a very small area. It didn't go very far north, much past the hospital, actually, when it was built in 1910, was said it was too far out of town for people to go to. And it's now so close to downtown, it's ridiculous. So you think, okay, so that tells you how small Oshawa was. Everyone lived in a very small area.
That actually ties really nicely into my next question, which was, like, you talked about when the city was annexed right to the lake, right? When Oshawa became a city in 1924, was there any pushback from the community, like Cedardale, like south of Oshawa, was there any pushback to them being incorporated and annexed into Oshawa?
That wasn't reported much in the papers that survive. I think there are some anecdotal things I've heard from people saying, they preferred to be a bit more rural. Cedardale was its own little pocket, but also very industrial. You had the Joseph Hall Works, you had the Whiting, the tannery, they were all in Cedardale. So that they almost had their own little identity. And I think even people now you speak to, I used to have a friend of mine, her grandfather grew up in the 20s, 30s in Cedardale. And whenever you said to him where you were born, he would say Cedardale. He wouldn't say I was born in Oshawa, because he was born in 1921. So it was still Cedardale when he was born. And I think there's that sense of pride. And also it's odd too, like Cedardale didn't go to the lake. Like we had the lake, it used to be called Port Sydenham and then Port of Oshawa, and then it was annexed. So people lived at the lake and it was called Oshawa on the Lake. If you look at early directories, you can see sometimes people's address will say Oshawa on the Lake. It doesn't have a street. It just says, I live at the lake. So that's kind of that cottage country sort of mentality. I live at the lake. I've got my space down by the water.
Yeah, Cedardale has such an interesting history in itself, just of how many hockey players it produced, and just a wonderful little history that I've heard stories about as well.
Yeah, so I haven't even touched on the sports that existed at this time. I just couldn't get into it.
No,
but
that's a whole other topic that maybe we'll have to explore.
Yeah.
That list of the family budget, that was just so fascinating, and gives us a really good idea of what life was like and how people lived. I'm sorry, you might have said this, so I'm just want to clarify. Was that published in a newspaper? And if so, what was the purpose of it being published in the newspaper? Like, what was it trying to do? Like, advertise that, this, if it was a grocery store, this is the prices that we have.
Yeah.
Or was it just giving people an idea of, what life was, what a daily budget was, or a family budget, I mean?
Well, I'll go back to the budget, actually.
Fascinating.
And it's so many pictures I've got here. Going back to the budget, it was taken from a advertisement, sort of like a booklet, advertising the benefits of moving to Oshawa. And this wasn't the only part. This was just one page in like a 30 little page booklet saying, you know, like almost like a tourist guide, as well as move your place to Oshawa, you know, move your business to Oshawa. There's lots of opportunities, as well as, hey, move your family to Oshawa. This is what it costs to live in Oshawa. So that's the present. It wasn't in the paper. It was actually in a city guide. It was called Oshawa, the Industrial City. And it's a book we have digitized and on our Internet Archive collection page. So I sometimes, when I'm looking through different documents we digitize, I pull out these little snippets, because it's like, who would think to look for that so when I found it a couple of years ago, I saved it just as an image, and I've kind of lost the trail where it was. I remember where it was from, but I need to record the source of it, because some people might find this and not know where it came from.
But that's so interesting to know what the intention was, is that it was trying to tell people that, you know, this is what it's like, this is how much it's going to cost to live in Oshawa, and as like a promotional thing to draw people here. But this is just such an important document in terms of like what life was like in the 20s. I just find it really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And when we say, see, look at how much milk was, well, it was, you know, 50 cents for, what is that? 50 cents for 6 quarts of milk. So
well, I loved when you kind of mentioned about the price of radios versus like these daily budgets, and just how extravagant that would have been. I can see, yeah, Cynthia's comments is that I wish butter and milk were still that cheap, and I 100% agree, Cynthia, that I feel the same way. And just to answer your question, that this is recorded and it will be posted on the RMG's site. So then going back to kind of like the radio history, I thought that was really fascinating, because Williams Piano Company, that was existed in downtown Oshawa in the 20s, shifted to producing radios because of the, you know, less demand of pianos in the 20s, when people were, you know, recovering from the war, and that's also another big expense. But I've always wanted to know more about that side of the Williams piano history. It's like, I'm not sure if you know, Nicole, so I'm just kind of talking it out, is that there's this kind of part of that, the piano company's history that people don't really talk about, is that they produced radios. And I'm just wondering, like, do you know if they were successful? Because I know they did shut down in the 30s, right? So I'm just curious about what happened with their radio business and whether or not it actually really took off.
I don't think it did. I don't know a whole lot of detail about it. I'm aware kind of peripherally, as you are, that they moved into radios for a time, but if it had been successful, I think they would have survived a little longer. I think it was just a sideline. They were still doing pianos. They didn't focus just on radios. You do see advertisements for pianos dropping off markedly. You don't see them advertised in the paper as you did before this time. And I think there are I've seen ads for radios like Williams Radio being available in various stores around the city, meaning around the, you know, the four corners, really, like Simcoe and King, where everybody was located. So I don't think it was that successful from what I've seen, but I don't know a whole lot of detail about it yet.
Yeah, that's my impressions too, just based on kind of the trajectory of what happened with the business. But yeah, just when you brought up radios and how their cost was, like the point of them shifting to radios was to, you know, pianos were not very needed and were very expensive, but radios were also very expensive. I just thought that was really interesting. Well, the other kind of standout moments for me, Brett, the Loblaws Brocheteria. Like, what? I can't believe this existed. This is actually something I did not know. And we at the gallery don't have any pictures of Loblaws Brocheterias.
Yeah, I was going to show you that.
In the Thomas Bouckley collection. And just, that's so fascinating. Because sometimes when I'm speaking to teenagers, I show these pictures of like cash and carry stores and kind of compare them and have them think about what our superstores are like today. And I had no idea that I had a more direct comparison with Loblaw Groceterias versus Loblaw superstores today.
Mhm. This was taken from the Ontario Reformer of 1924, I believe. These papers are digitized by the Oshawa Museum and available online, which is what I use for this. So I just took a screenshot of it, honestly, and it's not a bad little image, but there's no photographs that survive, so it's just this sketch, really. And you might see there might be other advertisements that exist in the paper. I haven't scoured through all of them. I have this plan to maybe have a student go through all the digitized papers and copy, take a little snapshot of every advertisement of all the different businesses and have an index of all of those. Because often people will come in and say, do you have information about my grandfather's store? It used to be on this street. Or do you have a picture? Do you have advertisements? And there's no way to really easily search for it if the papers aren't digitized. We only have papers digitized up to about 1930. The museum has done those. We have the rest on microfilm up until now, but they aren't searchable until we digitize them. So that's a plan I'm hoping to fund for the next few years to get that done.
Well, I know how incredible amount of work that you have on your plate, and you're a very important role in this community and at the Oshawa Library. So, but that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for participating, and to Nicole for doing this wonderful presentation, giving a really great in-depth look at what it was like living in Oshawa in 1920s. And again, please check out the online exhibition. If you want another version of this presentation that Nicole has done, you can find it on the library's YouTube page. It's kind of a different way of looking at it as well, but it's really fantastic. So take a look at that. Thanks so much. Again, I just want to end on one more note that the Robert McLaughlin Gallery is opening back up to the public on Tuesday, August 3rd. So please come back to the gallery and see the art and exhibitions. And you know, we have this wonderful exhibition up in the Bouckley corridor right now that has been put together by the Community Development Council of Durham that shows kind of what life is like for newcomers and immigrants in Oshawa. So come visit the gallery. We can't wait to have you all back, and stop by the library and have Nicole look up some genealogy history while you're here. Anyway, thanks so much, Nicole, and thanks everyone for participating today.